I didn't figure out a way for it to work for me. I never had that moment, which made me feel like a failure. In some ways, this year one of the podcast, was a failure. And you might be listening and you're like, no, hey, it's not a failure, but just hear me out. Last time we sat here talking together was when I sent you my little voice note telling you that I was taking a holiday break. And I did take a holiday break, and it was needed. It's been needed. There was a real chance when I posted that. I felt that there was a real chance I was never going to make a podcast episode ever again. And maybe not never. I don't think I thought that I would never make a podcast again, but I thought that I might not make one for the near to foreseeable future. And that thought really, really, really scared me. And I was giving myself permission for that to be true if, in my time away, if I felt that that was the decision that I wanted to make, not even needed to make, but wanted to make. I want to start, one of the things this year that I want to do is to do more of what I want and less of what I feel like I need, if that makes sense. Maybe I'll unpack that further in the episode, what those nuances are, but so many times I make decisions because I feel like I have to do this or I need to do it on both ends of the spectrum. Like, I need to do this thing because it's what I have to do to succeed, or I need to quit because quitting is what I need to do to succeed. But what about what I want to do? What do I want? And I'm really interested in, over the next year, building my life and my career around my wants. Of course, there's always going to be some things that you need to do, or you have to do, or you should do. But what could it look like to put want at the top of our list? Anyway, I thought that maybe I was never going to come back to this podcast. And I'm really grateful that that's not where I landed. And it's by no mistake. It's by no accident that that's not where I landed. I didn't land there because of some thoughtful work and questions on my end that I'm going to tell you about in this episode, but also because of some of the people around me. I'm really lucky to have people around me who have taken the time to get to know me well and want to help me find the right answers about what I want and what's best for me. And those people don't really have much, personal investment? Like, they want me to be happy and successful, and my happiness and success isn't really tied up in their own, right? There's an easier phrase for the type of relationship that I'm trying to describe here, but I'm lucky to be surrounding myself with more people who just want to help me get to wherever I need to be that's good and happy for me. So in this time away, it's been somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks at the time that this episode will go live. I have learned a lot, and I've made some, do I want to call them decisions? I've had some realizations about what I want this podcast to be. And some of these lessons have been impactful for, yes, the future of the Hello Haze podcast. But even more than that, I truly feel that in thinking about what I want to do with this podcast, I've actually made some decisions about how I want to live my life. And my life over the next year, because sometimes thinking about your life at large can feel very overwhelming and daunting. So I'm trying to make it smaller. Even thoughts of the next year can feel overwhelming and daunting. So I'm trying to make it, smaller. What am I focusing on this quarter, this year? Anyway, I'm rambling now. But I want to take you through some of those lessons. I want to talk to you about those lessons that I've learned in these 7 weeks away, about how I want to evolve and how I want to live and how I want to create. And my hope is that these lessons, look, I know that sometimes we have to learn lessons for ourselves. Sometimes we have to learn lessons for ourselves many, many, many times over. Many of the lessons that I'm about to tell you about, I have learned before, or I've thought before. Maybe it's the difference between thinking something for the first time. Maybe we have to think things and experience them many times before we actually learn them. If learning is... What is learning? I can learn a piece of information and then forget about it. So did I learn it, or did I just hear it once? Absorbing maybe is what I'm talking about. Some of these lessons I've heard before, I've experienced before. I've certainly thought that I learned them. I thought I knew them, but it takes time. And I'm not, I hope I've learned some of these lessons for the last time, but who knows, man? Some of these, I guess if I really think about it, most of these lessons are just things to come back to time and time again. And part of why I wanted to make this podcast episode and really reflect on them and share them with you and talk about them is so that there is something to remind myself when I lose track of these lessons, because I surely will. A lesson, maybe this is what it is. A lesson is not meant to be learned once and then learned forever. Maybe a lesson is something that we come back to, and the goal here is to be able to come back to it and remind ourselves of it and be comforted by it, rather than like to learn it and then never need to address it again, right? So this episode is going to be all of those lessons, and then we are going to do an advice letter at the end. Another reason why I want to share this with you is because this state of mind that I'm in right now in January of this year, and when I sat down to think about this episode, it was December, so really like the end of the year, beginning of the new year. When I think back to a year ago, I was not in this place, you guys. I was in a completely different state of mind in December, January 2023, 2024. Like I had not yet launched this podcast, but I was going full steam ahead into the podcast, even though I wasn't really ready to do it. I wasn't really ready to do it. And I don't want to give too much away, because don't give too much away. Don't give too much away. You're going to get into it in the episode. But I feel just kind of like gobsmacked by how different I feel about myself and my future and my choices and my confidence. Like I can't believe it's the same person. And part of me does feel a little bit like a broken record. Like, am I really still talking about my relationship with this podcast a year fucking later? But hey, again, some lessons take a while to learn. So this episode, we're going to go through some of those lessons I learned. Yes, they're about me in this podcast, but I hope my intention, as always, is that they relate to you, and that the lessons I'm learning, you will be able to apply them to something in your life that you might be struggling with, or that you might have questions about. And then after the lessons, we're also going to answer an advice letter from somebody who is just recently turned 30 and is wondering, like, how do you find purpose in life? How do you know what you want to do? What's the first step? And I promise there'll be some connections there, as there always are. So with that, let's dive into what I learned during my month off from this podcast. The first lesson I learned was that I have a tendency to put myself in a box when I'm looking to feel safe. Now, what do I mean by this? The specific box that I put myself in had to do with my advice column, Hello Haze. My mission and my purpose with Hello Haze, even before I stumbled upon like the art of the advice column, I was a writer, I was an artist, I am those things. And my goal and my purpose through my work has always been to make people feel seen and validated for their feelings, and to help each other better understand the feelings and experiences of others. I really want to help people feel seen, and I want to feel seen through my work. That's why I do this. Like, that is what motivates me. That's what feels fulfilling, is getting to do that. My friend Stephanie always says, I'm going to butcher it, but she says it so much more beautifully, that like the key to happiness is using your gifts to serve the world. And when I started to find success with Hello Haze as an advice column, I became like very desperate for that. I didn't want to lose that. And I still feel some of this desperation not to lose that, which is interesting, because if you look at my behavior over the last year, you might say that I've done a lot of things to potentially lose that, namely like pull back on making the column. So I found success with Hello Haze as an advice column. And then when I wanted to grow, when I wanted to scale Hello Haze and to make it something that didn't just live on TikTok, because my goal was never to be like a social media creator first. I thought that everything I had to do needed to be within that box, the box of the advice column, as a format, because if I didn't stay within that box, then I might fail. So I clung to that box, and I never even actually gave myself a chance to think outside of the box, right? We hear that phrase, like, think outside of the box. I was really scared to do that. When I started this podcast, I didn't even consider that it could be anything other than the advice column. And it wasn't just fear. I also thought that it made a lot of sense. Like you guys know, if you've been listening to me for a while, I am not always the most concise. I like to talk. Brevity is not my strong suit. I'm long-winded. I go on tangents, and my videos were always 3 minutes. So I was like, hey, the format of the advice column already it's ripe for long form. So like, it's going to make a lot of sense in the podcast. And I think it does, but I missed out on an opportunity for my own growth by not allowing myself to think, hey, do you want to make the advice column in podcast form? I didn't ask myself that. I didn't even allow myself to get close to asking myself that. I didn't consider my own wants at all. And that is a lesson that I learned. I feel like I learned that lesson the hard way. I wish that I had. I wish I had given myself more time up front to experiment rather than forcing myself to be in a box because I thought the box was going to help me. I have a lot of empathy though. Is empathy I feel like if I use empathy, sympathy, etc. wrong, people are going to like roast me because I don't always fucking know the difference. I can be kind to myself for understanding why I was clinging to the box. At the time, I was really struggling with a lot of personal trauma. I can use that word, personal trauma. And I really wanted to feel safe. So I clung to this thing that felt safe. So I get it. I get why I did it. But that's a lesson I've learned. And now I'm conscious of it. Like, what are the boxes when I have an opportunity for change, or even if I don't have an opportunity for change, but I'm just kind of in my regular life, like, what are the boxes that I'm putting myself in because I'm trying to protect myself from something? Like, think about something in your life that's just, you think of it as like a given, or like it's just expected, or like I have to do it this way because for some reason. Is that a box that you're putting yourself in? I don't know. I'm hyper aware now of like the boxes that I might be putting myself into because I'm trying to protect myself from something. And then from there, like questioning whether that's necessary. And what I'm learning is that I don't need to be in that box. I don't need to be in that box. And that's part of what inspired me to come back to the podcast, is saying, hey, love, you don't need to be in that box. Let's start by asking yourself, do you want to make this podcast only as an advice column? And we'll talk more about my answer to that as we go through this, but I don't need to be in the box. The box is there by my own volition. I put the box there. I built that fucking box, and now I can take it apart so that I can grow. So that's lesson 1. Lesson 2 is that, man, I thought that I understood failure. Like, I'd be the first one to say, I mean, hopefully I would say it better than this, or like more creatively than this, less cliche than this, but I'd be the first one to say that like failure's expected. Like, don't worry about failure. I can't even think of the cliche, but there's plenty of cliches about failure. I just can't even think of the one that I'm trying to reference right now. But I'm realizing that I really did not understand like failure as a concept, and that I definitely still have super negative connotations of what failure means. Intellectually, I know that in any new venture, failure is inevitable. But I don't think I applied that towards myself. I don't think I knew that failure was inevitable. I thought that failure just meant that I was on the wrong path, that I had made like irrevocable, that I had made mistakes that I would not be able to turn back from. So I became very scared of failure. But I'm going to reframe that. And I learned that, you know what, in some ways, this year 1 of the podcast like was a failure. It kind of was a failure. And I want to talk to you about why, within this lesson, let me talk to you about why I think it was a failure, but then I'll also try to reframe it. And part of this is that I'm trying to like expose myself to be more comfortable with failure in general. So I am going to talk about the ways that I think it was a failure. And you might be listening and you're like, no, hey, it's not a failure, but just hear me out. Let me talk about why it's a failure first. Oh, this is going to be vulnerable. So for one, I think the podcast was a failure because I never really got new people to listen to it. Like, I was very lucky, and I am very lucky to have an audience that like wanted to listen to the podcast from day 1 and has continued to listen to the podcast. And to those people, you're probably the same people who are listening right now. Like, I ride and die for you. Like, I ride for you, and I hope you know that. I feel very, very connected to you, and I'm very grateful for your listenership. When I first launched the podcast in January, I was also still very like creating very prolifically on social media. And the number one thing they tell you about podcasts is that like you have to be consistent. Like, if you want to grow your podcast and you want your podcast to be successful, you got to be publishing every week. You know, podcasts are like a very behavior pattern-based form of media consumption. Like, you listen on your Tuesday mornings and it becomes a part of your routine. And everyone would warn me, like, once you become some part of somebody's routine, people get really pissed off when you mess with their routine. And I get that. I don't take that personally. I also, when I'm looking forward to a show coming out on Thursday, imagine if it didn't come out, like I would feel personally offended by that. But I was very inconsistent over the year. Like I was extremely inconsistent over the course of the year, which would make listenership drop off. Again, there are some of you who have been here every episode, no matter how consistent or inconsistent I've been. And I am so grateful for you. And I lost some people, which, makes sense. And so it was a failure in the sense that like I never grew my numbers. I would lose them and then they'd get more stable. And I also wasn't doing very much like to promote the podcast because I was just one person and I didn't have the bandwidth. But that made it feel like a failure. I see other people launching their podcasts and they're like #1 on Spotify, #5 in comedy podcasts. And I never had that moment, which made me feel like a failure. And by some definitions, perhaps it was. Now, my podcasts are really hard to make. I think I also was in like the top, I'm not going to share percents, but like I in the world of podcasts, this podcast was very successful. Yet, of course, I'm just comparing to like I'm comparing to the elite of podcasts. And I sometimes can feel like, what's the point of doing it if I'm not going to, I believe in myself, right? And you might it might come off as arrogance or it might come off as, I don't know, but I do believe in myself. And I believe that when I focus on something and set my mind to it, I can be among the, tippity top of whatever it is I want to do. So part of me at times felt like if you're not going to really do it, why even do it? Which then made me feel like a failure. So that we could say that the podcast failed this year because it didn't grow. It didn't grow in listenership. I think the biggest failure though of the podcast in the year was that I didn't figure out a way for it to work for me. Like I wanted to make a podcast because I like really believe in the medium as a way of connecting to an audience and a community and a way of expressing oneself. Like, listen, my self-expression is one of the utmost priorities to me. That's something else I've learned. And I made the mistake of, I feel like I failed because I did not prioritize making this podcast sustainable. And I shouldn't have started something with any other goal in mind. Goal number 1 should have been, how can I build this podcast and structure it in a way in terms of format and support? Like, how can I structure it in a way so that I can do it for the next 10 years? God, if you start something and you already can't imagine how you're going to get it done the next week, like that's not the way I wanted to start this podcast, something that I hope can be a part of my career for the long term. And that feels like a failure. That was a failure that I didn't really focus on that in year 1. Okay, so those were the two, I'll call those the big failures. And then maybe we can throw in a third failure, which is just like the various absolute meltdowns that I've had related to those things. But those would be the failures. Now, why it wasn't a failure? Experimentation is not failure. Maybe that I failed to see this first year as experimentation. Maybe that's the failure. Like, I wish I had gone into it as, hey, this is going to be an experiment. Over the next year, I'm going to make this podcast so that I can figure out like how it is I want to podcast and how it is I like to podcast. And so many big podcasters did that. Like, one of my favorite podcasts is The Broski Report with Brittany Broski. I think she's brilliant. And it's one of my favorite podcasts. I had no idea that before The Broski Report, she did another podcast with somebody else. I wonder if she thinks that podcast was a failure. If so, I would say, hey, you probably learned a lot on that podcast about what you did like to do, what you didn't want to do. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about, that's how I'm going to think about this first year. Like, yeah, it was a failure and it was an experiment. Both things can be true. But I hope that in the future, I can, when I embark on any new project, I leave room for failure, because you have to fail to learn, to then make better things. And if my goal is to make great things and to keep growing and learning, then of course I'm going to fail in the meantime. So I hope that I can be less hard on myself when those failures occur, and that I can see them in the moment as the like experimentation that it really is. Another lesson that I learned, and this is something actually that my therapist pointed out to me, which is that growth is one of my core values. And I don't mean that in like a, look at me, I love self-growth, like self-help, I'm just always growing. I don't mean it that way. I mean that I really value being in situations where I can evolve. And I think it goes right back to that first lesson about like being in a box. Like, boxes, even if I'm doing it to protect myself, they end up feeling really suffocating for me. I am a person who needs experimentation, and I need to be able to grow into things. Otherwise, I'm going to get bored and I'm going to get frustrated. And I think this might be part of my like ADHD neurodivergent brain, which is something I've been talking about all year with my therapist and navigating the world of like getting that diagnosis. And that's a whole other topic, but I'm so grateful to her for helping me see the ways in which my brain and my ways of thinking, like the way that I think, the way my brain works. I mean, I never thought about those things until I started working with this therapist. And every therapist, I've had 3 different therapists in my life. Love them all. They've all saved my life in various ways. And they've each brought something very different to the table and helped get me to like the next level of my happiness, recovery, healing, whatever you want to call it. But learning about how I may have had undiagnosed ADHD for all of my life has been pretty eye-opening with this therapist in particular. And as she and I were talking about the podcast during this break, she pointed out to me that, she said, everything I know about you, Alexandra, is that you really value growth. And it seems like the way you were structuring the podcast with every week had to be 3 advice letters on a topic, and that's what you had to do. That didn't leave you much room to grow. And she was right. Like when she said it, I'm like, oh my God, it didn't leave me much room to grow. And I love making my advice column. But when my advice column is the only thing I feel permission to make across every single format, I feel like I can't grow. And that makes me resent it. And I want to be really specific when I say resent it. I do not resent giving advice, and I do not resent writing to you and writing letters. And I love Hello Hayes, the advice column. I love it. I love it. I cherish it. What I resented was the feeling I put on myself that was the only thing I was allowed to do, that was the only thing I was good at, that's the only thing people would care about. And in talking with her about this, and in talking about some of the podcasts that I love listening to the most, such as The Broski Report or Anything Goes with Emma Chamberlain, my podcast can be a place where I always have permission to grow, and I always have permission to try new things. And I do not need to be beholden to the advice column or any specific thing for that matter. That's what I want to make. That's how I want to use this podcast platform. And I want the podcast specifically to be a place where I can experiment and grow, because it is a core value of mine. And if I want to make this podcast for the long term, if I want it to be a part of my career for the next 10 years, then it needs to be that. It needs to be that. So as far as the future of the Hello Hayes podcast and what you can expect to see, I think that you can expect things to feel more fluid. And I think you can expect it to feel different week to week, though always the same. The heart, I know people don't always like to think about like how the sausage gets made. And, I saw Timothy Chalamet. I saw something about how apparently the producers on the Bob Dylan movie that he's in, I'm blanking on, The Complete Unknown, wanted to like document his process of getting into character. And he said, no, I'm not doing that. He didn't want to have a whole social media campaign about how he became the character, because he's like, let people be delighted. Let people escape into the magic of watching someone become a character. So I bring that up because like, I know not everybody wants to know doesn't want to think about like the person behind the advice columnist or like the person behind the content you're consuming. You just want to consume it. Where the fuck was I going with this? My God, Hayes, this is what it feels like inside my brain. Sometimes I just go from here to here to here to here to here. Where was I going with that? Oh, while not every episode is going to be an advice column moving forward, you can expect the same heart. And you might not know what it is you love about the advice column, but a huge part of what makes Hello Hayes special, and I think different from other advice columns, and I'm going to talk about my gift or my unique sprinkle, and you have one too, and whatever it is that you like to make. Like, it is my heart, right? It's my heart. It's the way I see the world. It's the way I approach feelings. It's the way I process things. It's my writing, the way I better than I can do right now, but the way that I can take really complex feelings and try to put them into words. That's what makes Hello Hayes special. and of course the kind of the connection between me as the creator and you as the person writing in, I'm going to take that special sauce, I'm going to take that heart and bring it into everything else I do. It just might not always be in advice column format. So that's what you can expect. So that was lesson 3, growth is a core value. The next lesson 4, and we've got 7 lessons, okay? 7 lessons, so bear with me. The next lesson is that in the moments when I thought I really resented podcasting, like I hate podcasting, I don't want to be a podcaster. Those are some things that I might have said in my lowest of low moments. I realized I didn't resent podcasting. I resented my approach. And like, of course I resented my approach. I was approaching this podcast in such a rigid way. And I'm not a rigid person. Like a lot of people thrive in really clear structures. I don't. I thrive in some structure, but like I thrive in making the structures work for me. And I was approaching this podcast in just a way that didn't work for my interests or my brain or the way I want to work and the way I want to feel. Like, of course you grow to resent things that you don't want to do, especially when you don't have to do those things. Like, guys, there's some things that we all just have to do, right? There's some things with everybody's job or everybody's home responsibilities that we just have to do. And you might resent some of those things. But the stuff that you choose to do, like how I was choosing to engage with this in a way that was making me miserable. And again, I'm very grateful to my therapist for helping me see that, which relates to my next lesson is about really making sure that you're seeking opinions from the right person. And there was we had a session, it was a virtual session over the holidays. And the week before, I think I had talked about how I had decided not to do the podcast. And this was a decision I was going to make. And I'm not going to do it again because it's not serving my larger goals and it's distracting me from other things I want to do. And I was feeling really kind of depressed about it. And I wasn't in a state of depression. I want to be clear about that because I've talked about like my how I did struggle with depression this past year. It wasn't that, but I was struggling with this podcast and what I wanted it to be. And having come out of a serious depression this year, I've become very protective over like making the right decisions for myself. But sometimes our instincts, like sometimes my instincts or my impulses around what the right thing for me to do is can be a little bit aggressive. It can be very black and white. Similarly to how I just like made choices over the last year to like stop making TikToks. And listen, that was the right thing to do at some point. I was having a very, very, very intense reaction to making TikToks and receiving comments. And I absolutely did need to stop that when I stopped doing that. But I'm not in that place anymore. And when I made this like decision to stop doing the podcast, I thought it was the right thing to do. But then after a week and after I gave myself the break and I missed it and I was thinking about it more, I went back into therapy and we came to this conclusion, which is that I can make the podcast, but I need to find the right approach to it. I need to figure out a new way to make it. And anyway, in this virtual session, we had previously talked about some of these changes that I can make and how I can make the podcast work for me. And I thanked her because I said, let me try to remember exactly what I said. I said, I really appreciate how you give me room to change my mind. Because when I came in a couple of weeks ago and said that I'd never wanted to make the podcast again, you're not holding me accountable to that. Like, you're not forcing me to live by the things I say out of fear. You're sitting with me and helping me make sure that I'm making the best and right decisions and asking me questions so that I am doing what's best for me instead of just making decisions out of fear. And thank you for not hearing me say that once and then making me do that. Thank you for actually being curious about what I really mean when I say those things. And I thanked her for that. And I am like truly deeply thankful. And my therapist is not the only person in my life who kind of is flexible with me that way. And when I say the lesson is like seek the right opinions, I mean, surround yourself with people who are flexible and who encourage flexibility in you and who challenge you to see that maybe your initial reaction, your initial explosive reaction, like might not be the best. Spend time with people and seek opinions from people who want to unpack that with you. Even like one of my best friends, Stephanie, when I called her, the voice note I left you guys before I took that little break, part of that was her idea, because I was like, how do I tell them that I'm not sure what I want to do about this? And she said, you know, Alexandra, like, what if you don't have to make any decision right now and you just take a little break? And you don't need to make it a big deal right now, and you give yourself some time to think about this. And I was like, I don't need to make it a big deal right now? Like, I don't need to make some big announcement? And she said, no, why don't you just say, it's the holidays. Like, you're taking a holiday break, which is true. That's not a lie. Just it's okay to take the break, and it's okay to not make it a huge deal. And I'm so grateful for that advice, you know? And I'm very grateful for having those people in my life. So I encourage you to think about who those people are in yours, so that you know who to go to. You know who to share these. When next time you make a big decision, a big emotional decision, maybe you share it with those people who tends to be flexible with you, who tends to challenge you a little bit, who tends to help you make kind of like the least explosive decision. And the last lesson is about the power of self-talk. Now, I've always been a person who talks to myself, not just like self-talk, but talks to myself. I talk to myself constantly. Like if I'm writing, I'm talking to myself. In the kitchen, I'm talking to myself. Like I don't know how to better explain it other than I have an inner dialogue, and sometimes I am using my mouth to use the words. Like sometimes there are times when I'm stopping at a red light and I look and I notice the person next to me is like looking at me, and I've been fully having a conversation with myself. I, however, used to sort of think that like positive self-talk was a little bit woo-woo and like it didn't really work. And I just kind of rolled my eyes at it a little bit. By positive self-talk, I mean telling yourself it's going to be okay, talking to yourself the way you would your inner child, or talk to yourself the way you would a friend. I just was sort of like, like, do I really? No, thank you. No, thank you. However, all of these lessons I've learned over this break and over this year, yes, I've learned these lessons. However, every day, there is a point every single day where my fear comes to the surface, and my fear tries to tell me that I've made a mistake I'll never be able to recover from. Every single day. And I'm starting to accept that, you know what? Maybe fear is just a part of my life. And maybe I will never be a person who lives without fear. I will always have that voice in my head because my fear is there for a reason. I know it's trying to protect me from something, but the best way that I can deal with my fear is to talk to it, is to be kind to it, but to let it know that it's not leading the show. I've reread Big Magic by Liz Gilbert, who's one of my favorite writers, and she writes about fear so beautifully, specifically this idea that we have to make room for our fear, and we have to make room for our fear, and it can sit in the back seat on the road trip that is our life, but it will never be allowed to take the wheel. And I've really taken that to heart. Just last week, I started to feel some fear about, hey, well, if you're not, you haven't been posting a lot on social media, and like if you don't start posting a lot on social media, then none of your dreams are going to come true. And if you're not posting, then no one's going to want to read your work. And if you write a book one day, no one's going to want to buy your book, and you're never going to be able to sell your book to a publisher because you haven't been posting on social media. And the podcast, don't even get me started about the podcast. Like, look at this long break you took. This is the worst thing you could possibly do for a podcast. Consistency is key. Consistency is key, Alexandra. What's the point of even making it if you're not going to do it every week? And if you're not going to make 5 social cuts per episode? You get the idea. That's what my fear sounds like. How exhausting is that? How exhausting is that? I hope it sounds familiar to some of you. I mean, I don't hope it sounds familiar, but like, I hope it sounds familiar and that I'm not just sharing that I'm like actually crazy. But hey, you know what? I am crazy. We're all a little crazy. But that voice isn't going away. And I know she's trying to protect me from hurt and loss and rejection. But I've been talking to her. Like over the last 6 weeks, I've gotten better at talking to her. So when that voice comes up, I say, hey, I know you're really worried about what's going to happen, but I trust right now. I'm letting my creativity lead the show. I'm letting my inspiration lead the show. I'm putting trust. I'm gonna give myself the trust right now. I know it feels really scary to not be doing everything at once, because I know you're scared that if we don't do it all at once, then it's never gonna happen. But I'm gonna try actually just having trust. I'm gonna try trusting that I know what to do. And I'm gonna try trusting that as long as I keep taking care of myself and indulging my creativity and putting my work out into the world and helping others, and trying new things and listening to what I want and not just what I think I need to do. Like, I'm going to trust that it's going to work out. And I don't know how it's going to work out. It might look different than what I originally wanted, or the thing that makes me happy, the thing that ultimately makes me feel happy and fulfilled might be different than the thing I think I want. And I'm going to just trust that. So fear, I hear you. I love you. I'm grateful for what you're trying to do, but everything's going to be okay. So just take a seat in the back for now. Like, I've been doing that a lot more, every day at least. And I tell you that I'm doing it every day in case your fear talks to you every day. It's okay if it does, and it's okay if you have to talk. It's okay if you have to talk back to your fear every day, like just to function. And as I've gotten more deliberate about talking to my fear, like, I've noticed the voice gets a little bit quieter. Again, she's there every day. My fear is there every day. But my God, I feel so much better when I talk to her, and I feel much more equipped to deal with my fear, knowing that, like, the voice, like that love voice is within me, and like it's always within my reach. I can always talk back to my fear. And sometimes I need some help. Sometimes, I call a friend and I say, my fear is doing this right now. Like, can you give me the pep talk too? That's okay to ask for that. But I feel just so much better equipped to deal with whatever is ahead in this year because I know I have my own voice. So I think the closing thought about these lessons is like, I'm relearning how scary change is. Speaking about fear, like I feel really scared about sharing these changes with you. I feel scared that you're going to be upset with me, that I don't know how to articulate them so perfectly or clearly. I feel scared that I'm going to fail. But I guess what was my lesson? That failure is just experimentation, and failure is definitely going to happen. I'd like to be successful. I'd like this to be successful. I'd like this to be successful in lots of ways. I'd like it to be successful in terms of my purpose. Like, I'd like it to feel valuable, and I'd like it to be a successful, like, part of my business, But what I'm trying to also remind myself is that feeling scared does not mean you're doing the wrong thing. Feeling scared, I find that fear usually kicks in when you're on the precipice of doing something new and exciting and bold. So thank you guys for listening to all of that. I hope there was something in there that was helpful and useful for you. And if not, then at least maybe you feel a little bit closer to me and learning about some of the things that I've been thinking about over the last several months. So now it is time for our advice column, because I did want to do an advice column in this letter. And let me also say that I'm not like getting rid of advice columns. They still might be in the podcast. And I'm hoping, I haven't been making that many advice columns on other platforms because doing 3 a week in here was a lot. But I realized that I like writing my advice column. I like writing my advice column on Substack, and I like writing them. Like, when I make a TikTok or a short video of an advice column, like, I wrote that. And I like, the podcast is much more talking through the process and kind of coming up with it in real time, which is a thing I do when I'm writing, but I like writing them. Like, I feel a lot of satisfaction. I think it's really important to make sure that you feel a lot of satisfaction in the process of making the thing, and not just satisfaction in sharing of the thing. So I found with the podcast, when I was only doing advice columns, the most fulfilling part of that was connecting with you guys after about the episode and about the topics. But I didn't feel as fulfilled when I was just recording the advice columns and when I was thinking about them a little bit before, but then just talking through them. That didn't feel as fulfilling. So I was really relying on the connection we had afterwards to make that, 13 hours of work between prep and recording and editing and, doing the whole thing that makes a weekly podcast. I was really relying on our connection afterwards. But I get to connect with you in so many ways. Like, there are so many ways that I can do that. However, when I write the advice column, yes, I love connecting with you afterwards, and that's a huge reason why I do it. But I feel so much personal satisfaction in sitting with the letter and in writing it and in editing it and in figuring out what that last line is going to be and watching it all come together and thinking about my personal life and what experiences I want to talk about here. Like, the act of writing, which is missing from the podcast when I was only doing advice columns, I don't know, I missed that. And I wasn't doing it so much because I was putting so much attention into the advice columns for the podcast. So my hope is that Hello Hayes as an advice column is never going to go away. And my hope is that by giving myself permission to not just do that every week in the podcast, I will be able to write them on Substack more often. And I will be able to make those short videos, those like 3-minute Hello Hayes advice bangers. We don't know what's going to happen with TikTok, so I'll have to figure out what that looks like on Instagram or, YouTube Shorts, whatever. But just wanted to clarify that. I'm not getting rid of the advice columns. I'm reimagining where they can live. So with that, let's do our advice letter for today. Hello, Hayes. I just turned 30 and I've never really had a stable job, let alone a career. I feel aimless, restless, and honestly a bit penniless, and I really don't know where to begin. I spent a good chunk of my 20s caring for my dad. Now that he's gone, I need to find a reason to get up each day and be excited. Anytime I ask for help from my friends and family, they say, you just have to get going, but I don't even have a clue what the first step is to figuring out my life. Do you have any advice for someone who feels like they're starting from square one? Yours, Seeking Direction. Those platitudes, man. Getting advice like that, you just have to get going, can feel so demoralizing when you are in a period of aimlessness, as you described, seeking direction. So I'm sorry that you've been given that. I'm sorry that you've been given that advice, because maybe when you were asking for help, like you weren't actually looking for advice. You were looking for like validation. Maybe you were asking for specific steps, and if that's how they responded to you, even more frustrating. But I guess I just wanted to start by being like, hey, it's really annoying when we ask for help and support and people support us in a way that is so unhelpful. Like, you just have to get going. Like, we're not talking about going to the gym. Like, you're asking a big existential question about what to do with your life and how do you find meaning. That's really is impressive the right word I want to use? That you spent most of your 20s caring for your dad. I'm sure that time was special and challenging, and just so many feelings and words in between there. Good chunk of your 20s too. Those are some really formative years that you spent being a caregiver. And I don't want to I hope you are giving yourself the chance to know like how much that has impacted your worldview and like where you're at in your life. So if you're feeling any shame about being 30 and, not having a career or stability, like I want to take some of that shame from you. Because being a caregiver is a full-time job, and the grief that I imagine you were living with while he was still alive, and then once he has died, I want to like hold some of it for you and reassure you that the stage you're at makes total sense, and it would make sense. Like, it would make sense even if you didn't have that experience, because 30 is not old. It's normal. It's normal to be 30 and not know what you're doing. I'm turning 32 this year, and I feel like I've lived many different lives in terms of my career. I was a teacher, I worked in media tech startups, I did freelance consulting, and now I'm making Hello Hayes, which, jury is still out on what this will grow into and what it will become. I also feel aimless at times, and I think I feel most aimless when I am disconnected from my purpose. So rather than think about what you should do and like what type of job or career you want, I want to suggest that you first focus on like, how do you want to feel? And what do you want, right? We talked about this earlier in the episode, like focusing more on our wants rather than what we should do. When I first quit my full-time job to start doing consulting and freelance work, part of the reason I did that is because I had been feeling so dissatisfied and disillusioned by like corporate life. And I felt like I wanted to do something more. I knew I wanted to feel differently with my life. I wanted to write books. I was writing a novel at the time. I wanted to live and feel differently. I didn't like the way I felt. I did not want to spend this one precious life constantly feeling this like despair of going to work every day. I was working a freelance job, and one of the clients at the time was Indeed, the job search company, and I was working with a production company, and there was a career coach on the video, and as part of the compensation, I actually don't know how the contract was structured on their end. I did not have to pay for this, but I was paid for my work and I got free career coaching from her. And she was wonderful. We became friends. Shout out Nicole if you're listening to this. One of the best activities she got me to do at that time, so I was doing this freelance consulting work, but at the same time I was like, am I going to be able to afford to do this forever? Like, what do I want? How do I stop feeling so miserable? She gave me this exercise, and it was from wake up to go to bed. I want you to write down what your ideal work day looks like. And by work day, I just mean like not a weekend, not a lounging day, not a rotten bed day, but like a productive day. From the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, what would that day look like? And I wrote mine down, and I tried before recording this to find where I wrote it, and I couldn't find it, which really kills me. But I remember that my day included things like being able to eat lunch when I wanted to, having time to go for walks during the day, having multiple hours a day where I could really lose myself in a focus project. Like my jobs at the time had felt very like I was constantly just building decks and attending meetings, and I had no time for deep work. And I knew that I really valued deep creative work and getting into a flow state. And I wanted to be able to include that in most of my days. I want you to do that exercise. So from the time you get up and think about things like, what's the ideal time for you to get up? It's a privilege to be able to design your life in a way that like meets your needs. And we might not always be able to meet all of our needs and all of our desires, but I think we certainly won't have a shot at building the life we want if you've never even allowed yourself to dream about what the life you want is. And if you've been caring for your father for a good chunk of the last 10 years, I bet you haven't really asked yourself that question. So I know you feel a lot of pressure to have it all figured out, to figure out your life, as you said. You don't know what the first step is. You're starting from square one. But I want you don't have to figure anything out right now. The first thing you need to do is just think about what do you want your days to be like? I think from there, we can start to think about what are the types of jobs or what are the types of opportunities that allow you to live at least some of that. Now, you might not ever have a career, or you might have many careers. Like you might find that your job, like you want your job to just be the thing that pays your rent and allows you to live your life in that way. It's okay to not want like a one career. It's okay to want to have adventures and to have jobs within those adventures that pay the bills, because we have to be realistic. But you might not want a career and you might not need to have one. I want to lift that burden, or I want to just throw that out there that like not everybody needs a fucking career. Okay? You can get a job that you feel neutral about, that you don't hate, right? You don't have to, I feel like I don't want you to be searching to have your life figured out right now. That's really not the priority. I think the priority is for you to make progress on learning about who you are and what your adult needs are. That's the priority. Like that's what I want you to learn about this year, right? If all of last year I spent learning all those things I just talked to you about, which yes, were about the podcast, but are also just about my life and the way I want to live, like you're going to be on that journey now too, and just figuring out what kind of adult am I seeking direction? Like, what do I like? What don't I like? How do I want to spend my days? This one precious life, like how do I want to feel? And then when you think about how you want to feel, then we can start building out our life around that, with that way you want to feel kind of front and center. I also want you to know that you're not starting at square one. You're starting at square like 40,000, however many days you've been alive. Like don't underestimate how many skills, how much life experience you've racked up in this time. You felt like you've been aimless. You don't know what you've been doing. You've been extremely focused on something. The love that you poured into your dad and the attention and the care you poured into him, I know that that's going to be poured back into you in dividends. And that's why I want you now to really use this moment to just think about what you want, because everything you want, I think you will have. But if you don't think about what you want, you're just going to continue to rack up like jobs and experiences, and you'll continue to move, like you'll continue to make progress. You'll be going in a direction because we always do. But if you don't ask yourself what you want, you might find yourself with a bunch of opportunities that you never really were interested in. I hope that exercise about journaling what your ideal day looks like does give you some momentum, because I think that's what you're looking for. You're looking for momentum. Because once we feel that momentum, then we can keep going, as those advice givers, people in your life, friends and family have said to you, that you just have to get going. It's hard to get going from, when you're stagnant, when you're at zero, when you feel nothing, there's no wind behind your back. But I think that exercise will give you a little bit of momentum, because you're going to be thinking about yourself and your needs first, instead of somebody else's, or instead of like comparing yourself to where other people are at in their 30s. But I believe in you. I believe in you. You have all the time you need. There is no rush. There's no rush. You're right on time. And that is it. That is a wrap for today's episode. Okay. I was just about to take a sip of my coffee. And you know when your iced coffee does that thing where it sort of starts to separate, like the ice cubes and the nice color? Like it's doing this thing. And I needed a little bit of something. Anyway, and that is it for today's episode. Thank you all so much for your continued support. I appreciate you. And I'm so grateful for you. And I'm glad to be back. You're all the best. I love you. And I can't wait to continue evolving this podcast with you. So yes, you can expect advice in these episodes, but also expect other stories and rants and lists and maybe like debriefs of books. I don't know. We're going to keep things open. The space is evolving and I feel really passionate and excited about it. Like my list of podcast episode topics is getting longer and longer now that I've removed the box. So I'm really excited and I think you are going to love where we're going. So with that, I love you. I hope you have a great rest of your day or night or whenever it is you're listening to this, and I will talk to you soon.